the election, democracy in the UK. My name's Polly Curtice. I'm the Chief Executive at the think tank Demos, and I'm delighted to welcome our panellists here today, all of the audience in the room and all of the audience at home as well. So we're live streaming this today and should have an online audience on YouTube as well. So we'll be taking questions from them as well. So we're here to ask two big questions. What does Labour need to do to win the election? Or you can flip it the other way. What could it do to lose the election? And also, we're interested in what this moment in our democratic life and cycle means for the quality of our democracy as well. And our partners on the panel, the Electoral Reform Society, Engage Britain and Involve are all interested and care about the health of democracy today. So we're hoping to really bring that into the conversation. I'm going to start by introducing our speakers, and then we're going to have an introduction from Sir John Curtice. So Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde and pollster extraordinaire, who's going to give us the picture of the road to the election. Pippa, the political editor at The Guardian, who's going to give us the political story in the run-up to the election. We've got Jess Garland at the end, Director of Research and Policy at the Electoral Reform Society, my colleague Miriam Levin at Engage Britain, and Sarah Castell at Involve. But we're going to start by hearing from Sir John Curtice. John.
Polly, thank you very much indeed. I'm slightly surprised that so many of you come for a bowl of cold water, but I'm afraid psephologists are always in that game. What I want primarily to do is, as I say, to critically evaluate where the Labour Party are at the moment, and in particular to try to address two related questions. First is, have voters primarily been pushed away from the Conservatives by the mistakes that the incumbent government has made, or have they been positively attracted by Labour? And secondly, to what extent has Sir Keir Starmer's repositioning of the party enhanced Labour's electoral advance? And of course, Sir Keir's repositioning is meant to be one of the ways in which the party is meant to be supposedly attracting voters. To do that, I'm going to look at 5 criteria. The first is whether or not the party has acquired a more moderate image for itself, given that one of the criticisms of the previous regime is that it was too extreme. The second is to give the public the impression that this party is capable of providing the country with competent government. The third, and also with effective leadership. The third is whether or not it could succeed in bridging the Brexit divide, given this has been a party that for the most part, at least until relatively recently, has been relatively reluctant to talk about the subject. Fourthly, and not unconnected with one of the reasons for trying to bridge the Brexit divide, is has Labour reconnected with its traditional working class base? Because certainly one of the shocks to the party after the last election was that actually the Conservatives won more votes amongst working class voters than this party that was created for working class representation managed to achieve. And then finally, and by no means least, to improve the geography of Labour support. And again, that was part of the reason for trying to focus in particular on Leave voters. I'm going to do a lot of this quite quickly. Some of what I'm going to say is basically just showing you some of the numbers behind commentary that a lot of people have made about this party, but hopefully you'll get the idea fairly quickly. A quick reminder of the trajectory of party support during this parliament, according to the polls. It's been a very unusual parliament. Normally we expect the government to have a bit of a honeymoon, and then hits a bit of choppy water, and the opposition pulls ahead to varying degrees in different parliaments. And then by this point at the time, we're kind of saying, well, will the government be able to catch up again or not? Hate to remind you, but for the first 2 years of this parliament, you were never, ever consistently ahead of the Conservatives in the polls. And this government remained remarkably popular well into this parliament. And then two things happened. One was Partygate. Conservative support falls by about 6 points in 6 weeks. And Pippa obviously had an important role in that. And the second was the Liz Truss fiscal event, where again, support for the Conservatives fell by about 6 points in 6 weeks. But you will notice how basically the Labour Party moved in the wake of Partygate to one plateau. Then after the Liz Truss fiscal event, it moved up to another plateau, and it's gone down a wee bit since, but since then it's been flatlining. Oh, and by the way, the last set of lines are the post-Conservative conference polls. Yes, the Conservative conference made absolutely no difference at all to the standings of the parties. So do not set your expectations too high as to what this conference will necessarily achieve. There was a lovely piece on the Conversation website which took all of the conferences since 1955 and compared the standing of the parties on average in the end of August, the end of October. And on average, across the whole of that period, party conferences have not made any difference at all. So you can enjoy yourself with abandon because people out there are not taking any notice. Okay. Now, slightly more seriously, the first thing I said was that the party's been trying to do is to give itself a more moderate image. Here it has clearly succeeded. The blue line is the moderate data from YouGov. And notice, because I'm going to refer to this more than once, that for the most part, this is not something that particularly happened around Partygate or around the Liz Truss fiscal event. This seems to be something where the party has indeed succeeded in changing its image, irrespective of what was going on the other side of the house. On the other hand, once we start looking at the pattern of responses to another YouGov question, which is whether the Labour Party are ready for government, you will notice how that basically attitudes changed quite dramatically in the immediate wake of the Liz Truss fiscal event. In other words, rather than you necessarily persuading people over the course of this parliament that maybe you might know what you were doing, basically you have profited from the comparison. Okay. But it's also worth being, by the way, you'll notice it's still the case that more people think you aren't ready than are. And Ipsos have also asked a very similar question recently. For them, it's 38% who think that you're competent. That compares with 55% a year before the 1997 election. That's one of a number of examples I'm going to point out where this party is not as yet in as strong as a position as it was under Tony Blair before the 97 general election. Equally, similar vein, whether or not this party is regarded as competent or incompetent, and you can see the particular wobble that there was in the wake of the Hartlepool by-election at the beginning in the spring of 2021. But again, you will see it's kind of come more recently, but it's really again in the wake of the Liz Truss fiscal event that things changed. Now, if you're going to provide air of credibility, then undoubtedly the leader is an important vehicle for any party to get their message across. These are Ipsos's net satisfaction ratings for Sir Keir Starmer. I mean, a couple of things to note. It started off relatively popular, but not long after the Hartlepool by-election was very much in the doldrums so far as popularity is concerned. It's never got back to that, but just notice it was around the Partygate that Sir Keir Starmer's image improved somewhat, and then it fell back again. Then the Liz Truss fiscal event, it improved, and then more recently, it's fallen back again. But perhaps what's also important, just compare the net satisfaction for Sir Keir Starmer with that of Tony Blair. Tony Blair had positive ratings throughout his leadership through to 1997. Sir Keir, as you can see, is way, way behind. And indeed, actually, I hate to tell you, but David Cameron also had positive ratings before the 2010 election. So the question of the leader, and the leader being somebody who actually attracts people to the party, is, I think, still an issue that Sir Keir is trying to address. The other thing, of course, it is widely said, which is that people don't know what the Labour Party or Sir Keir stand for. This is data on Sir Keir from Ipsos. And you can see, even amongst those who say they would vote Labour at present, there are slightly more people who disagree with that proposition than agree, but you are still looking at between a third and 2/5 of current Labour supporters who say, you know what, yeah, I'm going to vote for them, but I'm not quite sure what this chap is about. And equally also, on Mises a few months ago, asked people, how well do you think you know what Labour Party would do about education and health and defence and the economy? Amongst the public in general, it's about a third on for any of these things. Even amongst Labour supporters, it's only about a fifth. So, both in terms of competence, leadership, fitness for government, there is still room for improvement so far as this party is concerned. Meanwhile, of course, what's also true, I've got this slide twice, is that we should be evaluating what's happened about Brexit and this party's relationship to the Brexit divide. The first thing, of course, crucial thing, of course, to understand, this perhaps was not factored in when the party set out its strategy on Brexit 2 or 3 years ago, is that attitudes towards Brexit have changed. We are now, and have been on average, really ever for the last 12 months, been looking at 58% of people who say they would vote to rejoin the EU, and 42% say they would vote to stay out. So just hold on to that for a moment. Now, certainly if you look at, compare Labour's progress broken down by those who voted Remain and Leave in 2016, and compare that with 2019, you can see that although it's still the case that the Labour Party is more popular amongst those who vote Remain than it is amongst Leave, the 13-point increase amongst Leave voters since 2019 is markedly greater than the 4-point increase amongst Remain voters. So at first glance, it looks as though the strategy is working, i.e. this party has managed to disproportionately reconnect with Leave voters. However, that's looking at the position as of how people voted in 2016. But I've already shown you that quite a lot of people have changed their minds. And indeed, if you then look at the divide broken down by what people say they would do at present, just compare, it was 52-30 on 2016 vote, but once you look at current preference, it's 56-26. In other words, the party's vote now looks more clearly firmly embedded amongst those who would vote to rejoin the European Union. And there are three things going on here, which I'll go through very, very quickly, which basically mean that once you look at the current preference, this party's vote is almost as pro-EU as it was in 2019, which is not, I think, what it we're expected to end up. The first, here are the data, in fact, 3/4 of people who say they would vote Labour are people who are in favour of rejoining the European Union. That compares with 82% of people who were in favour of being inside the EU as of the 2019 election. So there's very little difference. I mean, ironically, the Tory votes become much less anti-EU, by the way, right? But anyway, that's another story. What's going on here? Reason number one why this is the case is that people who voted Labour in 2019 and who say they would vote Labour now have moved in favour of rejoin, like the rest of the public, no more than the rest of the public, but they have moved in that direction. So the people who've stayed with the party over the last 4 years are themselves now more pro-EU. Secondly, the people who have switched to Labour since 2019 are very strongly pro wanting to be inside the EU. Around 2/3 of them are people who would now vote to rejoin. And quite a lot of them, by the way, are people who have changed their minds. People who have changed their minds about Brexit are more likely to switch to the Labour Party since 2019. And of course, what's also true, yes, this party is picking up all the young voters, and all those young voters who have gone onto the electorate since 2019 are overwhelmingly pro-EU. So these three processes mean that actually the assumption that I think the Labour leadership had 2 or 3 years ago, that this party could never, ever be able to win a general election without reconnecting very disproportionately with Leave voters, has proven to be not true. This party has managed to get a very large poll lead without fundamentally changing the Brexit character of its support. And that obviously potentially has implications for the pressures that Labour will be under if indeed it does win the next general election. It is then also true, by the way, that this party is still not particularly more successful amongst working class voters than it is amongst middle class voters. That also has not changed. Basically, this party has managed to increase its support across the social spectrum. But what, of course, is still true is that this party is still very heavily dependent on the support of younger people. So, finally, the geography. You will all probably in this party be aware of this, but this is used doing the naughty arithmetic of saying what would happen if party support rose and fall by the same amount everywhere as compared with 2019. This is the old boundaries. It won't make much difference under the new boundaries because when the Tories won all those red wall seats, they won a lot of small constituencies. So the boundary view won't be as favourable to them as it would have been 3 years ago. But of course, the crucial thing is, under this naughty arithmetic, Labour has to be 12 points ahead of the Conservatives, maybe 13 under the new boundaries, just to get a majority of one. And the difference between that and the 17-point lead that Labour currently has is not that great. So changing the geography of this party support is crucial. So let's look at some of the evidence. This, first of all, is using Redfield and Wilton's data with they're religiously pretty much every week, looking at whether or comparing the change of support for the parties in red wall versus non-red wall constituencies. Now, Labour's made, actually, I think the figure on the right-hand side as well. Indeed, it is. Labour's vote in general is not up 4 points. It's up by about 12 points since 2019. What is it in the red wall, according to Redfield and Wilton? It's up 11 points. There's no particular evidence in this polling data of the Labour Party doing particularly well in the red wall. Of course, it doesn't have to do particularly well in the red wall, given how far it is ahead, because all these seats are marginal in the first place. Equally, I can take the British election study, which has 12,000 cases in it, 15,000 cases, its most recent run, and look to see, is Labour support in particular going up in marginal seats? And I'm defining here as marginal seats as the seats you would have to win on the naughty arithmetic to get a majority of one. Your vote's up by 13 points, pretty much the same as it is across the country as a whole. So it's not clear that this party is doing particularly well in the places that it thought it had to do particularly well in order to be able to win a majority. That said, there are other changes going on which will probably be to your advantage. One of them is, in fact, the Conservative vote is going down more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. But the second is, and this is the evidence of the local elections in May, there is clear evidence of tactical voting for you in places where you're starting off second, and conversely for the Liberal Democrats in places where they are getting off second. And that, of course, will be to the disadvantage of the Conservatives. The other thing, of course, which is potentially going to change, all that naughty arithmetic was on the assumption that the SNP would still be at the 45% that they were in 2019 in Scotland, and you all know that's kind of slightly changed. This is the tram line of the rise of the Labour Party, the changes in party support in the polls in Scotland since the Holyrood election. One thing, by the way, you need to be aware, the foundations of the revived Labour Party in Scotland are not the travails of the SNP. They are, one, Boris Johnson and Partygate, and two, Liz Truss. The Labour Party in Scotland was already at 30% at the back end of last year before the SNP ever hit trouble. It's now profiting from the fact that, given it managed to get to that level, that the SNP are now also in trouble. But whatever the cause, the potential consequence is potentially important. This is using the opinion polls rather than Mother Glen to estimate what might happen if there were a general election now. And basically, 20 seats, the Labour Party looks not unreasonable. And as a rough rule of thumb, for every 12 seats the party can pick up in Scotland, you can knock 2 points off the lead over the Conservatives that you will need to get an overall majority. So I did promise you this was a deliberately critical evaluation. Some things have worked. The party does now have a more moderate image. There is evidence of some significant change in the geography of its support, but the truth is probably not in the way that the party was originally anticipating. It's much more to do with tactical voting than any particular connection with Leave areas. And that in other respects, however, we are talking about a party that seems very, very much to have profited from the mistakes of its opponents, rather than a party that's fundamentally changed the character of its vote since 2019, or which necessarily has yet sealed the deal with the rather substantial election of the electorate that is currently inclined to vote for it.
I want to ask just one very quick follow-up, if that's okay, before we go on to Pippa. But do you think Labour are going to win?
My answer to that question is the classic academic answer. It depends what you mean by win. I think the chances of the Conservative Party forming the next administration are extremely low. Hang on. That's not simply because of the fact that they're 17 points behind. It is also because they don't have any friends inside the House of Commons. And it's probably true that not even the DUP are necessarily going to help them out this time. All right? And that therefore Labour doesn't even need to be the largest party after the next House of Commons to be able to get a King's Speech through. I think, Frank, once the Tories are below about 320 seats, it's all over. They won't be able to sustain an administration. What is still up for grabs is whether or not we end up with a majority Labour government or a minority Labour administration. And the difference between those two things, I mean, politically, and given that the hand that the next government is going to be dealt with in terms of the fiscal and economic situation is a very, very difficult one, that's going to be the difference between chalk and cheese.
Thank you so much. So Pippa, picking up on that, what do you think is going to happen, and what could shift the course of events between now and the polling day?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. It wouldn't surprise you to hear that I was in the bar last night. I'm afraid that's, despite my reputation post-Partygate as being Westminster's biggest party pooper, I do like a drink or two. And I was talking to a Labour former cabinet minister, which gives you an idea of the age profile of the individual I was talking to, who said to me, he repeated that old adage about governments losing elections rather than oppositions not winning them. But I'm not 100% sure I agree on that, because I think that, yes, while it looks like Labour is on course, as John says, to be the biggest party post the next election, I do still think that is a could, not a will. They could win a chunky majority of their own, but there's a long way to go, and complacency is a dangerous beast. And wandering around conference, and obviously people have a spring in their steps for understandable reasons, that doesn't necessarily translate, or it doesn't translate into votes. There's lots to do. And while much of Labour's focus, or Starmer's focus, has been on convincing the public that they be responsible stewards of the economy, Starmer's aides insist that he does understand that he needs to provide hope as well as reassurance. We've heard a lot about the reassurance piece, fiscal credibility, sticking to spending plans. They want to get a decent majority, and they want to get a second term, because the state of, if Labour wins, if you win, the state of the economy that you inherit is going to be very difficult to do what you want to do in one term. And I don't think that they get to do that you get to do that unless you also inspire people. But it's sorry, I have to speak closer to the microphone. Sorry about that.
Take that one.
This one.
YouTube.
All right.
Yeah.
Suddenly gave burst the eardrums to people at home. Sorry about that. Okay, I'll sit a bit closer to it as well. So it's problematic, though, because after years of over-promising and under-delivering on things like levelling up and Brexit, the public is understandably quite sceptical about politicians' commitments. And that's not just Tory promises. That goes across the board. That distrust is focused on parties right across the political spectrum. And the other problem is, as I mentioned, the economic backdrop means that there's no money for big spending commitments. And I think that the £28 billion Green Investment Fund is going to be the centrepiece. It's going to be the biggest spending policy. Even if Labour wanted to, they won't be able to ride to the rescue of cash-starved public services anytime soon. And that window for manoeuvre is very, very narrow. Rachel Reeves, as we all know, has read the Riot Act to her shadow cabinet, telling them not to make any unfunded spending commitments before the next election, as it would be a gift to the Conservatives and the right-wing media. But that's a pretty hard message for some of you, for lots of people at this conference to hear. And the Tories have consistently been, I think, 17 points, you said, John, behind in the polls.
Yeah.
And they've got two more potentially damaging by-elections coming up, with Mid-Bedfordshire and Tamworth in the coming weeks. So for the Tories, they need something to either go very right for them or very wrong for Labour, and neither of those things at the moment seems to be happening. But the general election is potentially, need to do the maths, it's anywhere between seven and 13 months away. And Sunak and his team are putting on at least a good public display of confidence, whatever's going on behind the scenes of the Conservative Party. I've been very struck by how the last few weeks we've heard reporters being told on trips and at conference that he's fired up, that he's entirely confident that he can win. And before the summer recess, he was totally 100% on it, which is, sounds like he's getting quite good at the old Kendall Royce style motivational talk. But the worry among senior Conservatives, and I think I can't talk about Labour and Labour's chances without briefly reflecting on them, but the worry among senior Conservatives is that his optimism is misplaced, and that public opinion about the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party more generally might be approaching the point of no return. I was very struck at Tory conference last week, how the problems that the Tory party has been facing appear to just be mounting up, and it feels like sort of a lack of control. And when that narrative starts to form, it's really hard for them to break out of it. So their strategy, and again, I think you have to look at both sides of the picture for winning the next election. Sunak's own supporters do think that there's time to turn it round for them. There was an away day for party staffers a couple of weeks ago in Staffordshire. Isaac Levido, who's their sort of election guru, election strategist, said that their polling showed them that the Labour vote remains soft, that there's no great love for Keir Starmer out there, and that the don't knows are still up for grabs. And that Labour's dramatic victory, which you all celebrated in Selby, where they overturned a 20,000 majority, does appear to back up, in theory at least, that it was in large part won by disillusioned Conservative voters staying at home. And John's laughing.
Well, it's what the SNP said last week. It's what parties always say when they lose by-elections, right? They say the turnout was low and our far side stayed at home. That is a symptom. It's not an excuse.
Right. Well, it's the Tories' symptom or excuse.
Yeah, that's what happens when
with.
parties are in trouble. That people say they don't know and they don't turn out to vote.
But what is the case, though, is that there are Labour strategists still concerned that their success is down to as much in part as people wanting the Tories out, rather than people wanting Labour voters in. Now, that's not necessarily a problem, because, Tony Blair's, you'll know the exact figures, but Tony Blair's 1997 landslide was in part based on 1 million Tory voters staying at home. Is that about right? I don't know. Anyway,
it was based on people switching from Conservative to Labour, which is what's been going on in this parliament.
But there is still this issue about what, as far as Conservatives see it, as being soft Tories. And I actually thought that, I don't know whether any of you watched Keir's interview on BBC earlier with Victoria Derbyshire on the Coonsborough programme, but they did that word cloud, which they also did for Ed Davey and Rishi Sunak. And the words that sort of leapt out were don't know, nothing, not sure. That's not as terrible as Sunak's last week, which was rich, money, no idea, wealth. But it definitely indicates that there's more to do. Starmer has, I think, probably against the odds, transformed the Labour Party, and he's taken the fight to the Conservatives. But they're now on part 3 of his 3-part strategy, which is setting out what Labour would do differently, given that he knows he can't just rely on the back of the Tory woes. And what we've been told to expect this week is that Labour will start to answer the question that many people are asking about: if not us being if not them being the Conservatives, why us being Labour? And there are some key staging posts over the next few months, which I think we should look out for. The first of which, I mean, maybe conferences don't shift the dial at all, but we did a focus group with More in Common last week from Workington, home of the famous Workington man. And there was one takeaway from Tory conference, and that was HS2. So despite everything else, that was sort of the noise that sort of came out. And on HS2, specifically, that it was an indication, the decision was an indication that the Conservatives didn't care, that Rishi Sunak didn't care about anywhere north of Birmingham. So that's a pretty, terrible message for, given everything on levelling up and the red wall and the geography of where the Conservatives need to win. It's a pretty terrible message to have landed. But there are a couple of staging posts, just briefly to mention them. One is the autumn statement. Then we've got the King's speech. And then in the spring, we have the budget. Opinion is divided on when the next election will be. But what I do know is that Sunak was telling allies last week that he was banking on it being October. Of course, events could change that. But Labour and the Tories will be prepared for a spring election, but October. So they're the 3 staging points we've got up until that point. And I think the King's speech is really important because we'll hear things like, are they going to actually deliver on renters reform, for example, this side of an election, or is that going to be pushed back? And the budget, of course, is crucial because while they have not yet announced tax cuts, and they said that driving down inflation is it has to come first, I think that it is almost inevitable that the government will suggest tax cuts going into the next election, and it's going to be very hard for Labour not to match them. So we'll see what comes in the next few months.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Picking up on that, in a world where Labour might win a losing election rather than win a winning election, what's the case for electoral reform?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, the system itself is kind of the thing that tells us where things are going. I mean, electoral reform is really, and I'm talking PR for the Commons here, right? It's the final piece of a jigsaw. Yes, sorry. It's the final piece of the jigsaw of this sort of direction of travel that we've been.
No, is it working?
That is on. There you go. You're
Lovely.
You can croon away now, Jess.
What song do we want? So there's been this direction of travel, right, from 97 onwards of moving towards a power sharing model, and that's through devolution. It's come through changes to the House of Lords, and we've been on that road towards a more power sharing model. And for me and many people, constitutionally, PR is the last piece of that jigsaw. So I feel very much we're already on that road. But the voters are taking us on that road as well, because we've seen increased volatility, multi-party voting, all sorts of changes in the way that the voters behave, which means that we're not in a 2-party system anymore, and the system we've got just doesn't function very well in that scenario, and we end up with sort of strange outcomes. But also, people want the change. We see people are already in support of PR generally, but we've seen a shift recently where people really want that change to happen. And just being in many of the fringes around conference over the last couple of days, even on the fringes that aren't on democracy issues, people having conversations about people feeling frustrated, feeling dislocated from their country, feeling like things can't get better, and that feeling fear for those reasons. And I think the conversation that then we are having is, well, how do we fix that if, we've got so much volatility in the system, there's only one term, or if these challenges are so big, if there's no money, and looking at how our system functions is one of the ways that we can do that. And it's also quite cheap compared to other reforms. So, these are the sort of conversations that are happening at the moment. So I do think there's a direction of travel. I think PR will happen. I think the interesting question is who's going to deliver that and how soon? And I think that will really shape the next 15 years of our country.
Thank you for that. The other thing I was hearing in what Pippa and John was talking about was, and not to take the spring out of conferences step too much, but that there's not a positive thing that people are going to vote for at the moment, and the decision that's on the mind of the leader's office is certainly kind of, do we risk a different positive kind of vision for the country, or do we creep through and win on a losing government? And that's why I wanted to bring in Miriam at this point, because Miriam Engage Britain is thinking a lot about how to bring hope back into democracy and policy making.
Yeah, can you all hear me? Excellent, good start. Yeah, I think it's really interesting at this point to turn the conversation to where people are, to where the voters are at the moment. And I think this is going to come to the fore in this election, but it's actually something that transcends elections, which is the fact that people feel really disenfranchised, really disempowered. Yeah, me too, if that's any help. I think we could all safely say that we don't really trust politicians, don't really trust them to do what's best for the country. People don't see, I know I don't see politicians following the same rules that the rest of us have to follow. And that's a massive problem. So there's been some really interesting polling done, and the Constitution Unit at University College London survey last year found that 77% of people think that people like them have too little influence on how the UK is governed. That's a massive problem. 77% of people. It's like, this is government supposedly for the people, by the people. Doesn't feel like that. But to me, it gets interesting when we think about, okay, that's a problem, that's real. What are we going to do about it? How can you re-engage the public, rebuild trust in our democratic system, in our institutions? Because just going to the ballot box every 4 or 5 years, it's not enough to maintain a healthy democracy. I think it's actually really simple. People should be part of coming up with the solutions to the challenges that the country is facing. Foundations of democracy will be stronger if people have an active role in political and public policy decisions that affect their lives. Not everybody involved in every single decision. God, no, that would take forever and be unwieldy and impossible, but a representative group of people who experience the problem, who live it and breathe it every day, they're part of coming up with some of the solutions because they live it, they know the right questions to ask, and they've got really good ideas about what you can do to solve some of these issues. That sounds very theoretical and really difficult, and I'm not going to say it's easy, but it is possible. So I just want to very, very quickly talk about some of the work that we've done at Engage Britain that shows it could be done. Over the last couple of years, we've run an end-to-end policy-making process looking at how do you build policy that really tackles the challenges in health and care from the grassroots up. We started with community conversations, just listening to people. What do people tell us? What do people say is going well at the moment in health and care? Not so much. And what's going wrong? Quite a lot. Then we took their hundreds and hundreds of stories about things going wrong and put them in front of the Citizens' Assembly and said, okay, of all of these things, what are the priorities? What should we tackle first? And that gets you part of the problem, right? That tells you what the problems are, doesn't get you to the solutions, though. And that's really difficult because obviously issues around particularly social care are questions that successive governments have ducked for a very, very long time. But what we found is that when we took their top priority question, which was about social care staffing and the lack of care workers, when we brought together the people who are really at the front line of that issue, so frontline care workers, people who draw on care, care providers, people who run social care services for local authorities, they were more than capable of coming up with ideas that would actually change the system, change the way the system works, and actually improve things for all of those different parts of the system, for the people who draw on care and for the people who work in it. And through their work over 6 months, they came up with really practical, really sensible policy solutions that would make that difference. Everything from a green badge parking permit for domiciliary care workers to big structural changes like pay parity within the NHS. And that was really important to show, actually, you ask the people, they've got very, very good ideas, really sensible ones that politicians would do well to listen to, because these are the things that will actually change conditions for people's everyday lives. What I want to just really quickly look at, though, is we've all heard some quite depressing statistics about people's lack of trust in politicians and their faith in politics. But actually, personally, I'm an optimist, and I think that there is actually room for hope here in terms of how people want to engage with politics. And I don't actually think, contrary to what many people talk about, that voters, people are apathetic. I think people do want to engage if given the chance to do so. So every year, the government runs the Community Life Survey. And in 2022, that came up with some really interesting statistics. It showed that 27% of people feel able to influence decisions in their neighbourhood. It's a really small number. But 53% of people think it's important that they could do so. And that difference, that 26% gap, is where I feel a lot of hope. Because if we can find the ways for people to have their say in a really meaningful way, people will show up and they will engage and they'll get involved. But I think if we're really going to make change before the next election, not just the next election, but for all the years that are going to come after it, as well as this kind of bottom-up drive for greater involvement, you also have to have top-down change. You have to have people with the power creating opportunities for people to step into the room, to be involved in the decisions that affect them. Because without that, you get people on the outside clamouring for change, shouting for change, while people with the power inside the room sit with their fingers in their ears. What we have to do is we have to find those politicians who are open to finding new ways of engaging with the electorate, with the public, those people who want to involve politicians, who want to involve people to find a way through the massive, massive challenges our country is facing. Because we're interested in building consensus with people around solutions that the public will get behind, things that will transcend, I hope, party politics. And I have no doubt there are politicians from all parties who are interested in that. I think it's really important to rebuild people's trust in politicians, but I think it is even more important, it's vital, to build the trust of politicians in people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Certainly. Hello, I'm Sarah Castell from Involve. I'm the chief exec there. Our organisation does a lot of very similar work to what Engage Britain does. We are a public participation charity, and so we spend all of our time trying to make real, I think, some of the things that Miriam's just been discussing. How do you get the public voice into the spaces of power and into the discussions, particularly using techniques that help people to find common ground. And finding common ground is less sexy than lots of adversarial statistics about who's winning. And it feels less immediate, and it feels kind of less, it gets your adrenaline going slightly less. But when you're actually in the room with it happening, it can be absolutely transformative. And so to Miriam's point about how do you find politicians who are prepared to kind of listen more, to bring the public in, I think there's something about demonstrating these processes and showing them happening on the ground, and then using them to kind of show how they can make the change, they can live the change that we want to see. So I'm really struck hearing all these amazing different presentations and these different angles on our politics today. We have an incredible nuanced public opinion structure in this country, and we have the work of Sir John and colleagues, and this incredibly sophisticated look at what is it reactively that politicians can do to respond to what the public think, whether it's day to day on, in what to put in a speech or what not to put in a speech, month to month, year to year, and how to win an election. What we don't have in our politics is an ongoing, solid public judgment structure to enable us to see how policies are working on the ground and whether they're really working for people, and whether, as Miriam says, people can be brought into solving the problems that we face. And the problems we face are not party political problems. Climate change is not a party political issue, and it shouldn't be one. The economy is party politicised, but it also includes global complex problems which nobody can just sort of tick off and nail in one sort of short discussion and then rely on an opinion poll to tell them what should be done. So I think what I'd like to talk about is really how, if Labour does win power, how do we get beyond that one term? How do we inspire people? And how do we turn the scepticism about the whole structure and whether anyone can get things done into a healthy scepticism, a scepticism about how can we tweak things and change things? And I just wanted to give 2 or 3 examples of where deliberative and participatory processes have helped have helped politicians and helped governments come to decisions which they might not otherwise have come to. And the first one is probably familiar to some of you in the room, which is the Irish Citizens' Assembly. People always talk about this because it's just such a good example. It gives the line of thought right through from saying, you know, you've got a complex moral issue, something that politicians couldn't move on, that they were stuck on, something that the public at the beginning of that process for particularly for the abortion referendum and Citizens' Assembly, at the beginning of that process, the public were not in favour, in general, of legalising abortion. It was a very thorny issue. The Assembly happened. 65% in the Assembly voted in favour of terminations without restrictions. That it doesn't mean that the public then voted for it in the referendum because that's what the Citizens' Assembly said. But what you got from the Assembly was a forward look, a look at where the public would be once they had a chance to think about it. So when you've got issues that you think are salient, that are important to the future of our country, but that the knockabout of everyday politics doesn't let you get traction on, then that's the kind of work that can be done. I've got lots of other examples which I'm happy to talk about while waving my arms and drinking wine in a minute, but I'm also really mindful of time. And I just wanted to finish, I guess, with a bit of a thought experiment that I've had during this panel, which is that nobody cares what's happening here, right? No one gives a stuff what's happening in this room. What if there were 100 members of the public recruited by Sortition who were invited to conference, who were invited to come and speak and engage with all of you and with the leadership, and who were taken through with experts like Sir John, like others, academics, policymakers, to think through the challenges that we face? And what if they were given some say over some part of the manifesto, or at least a start, at least the beginnings of where it could go, the ways that we tackle these problems, which are not simple problems to address? I wonder whether, you know, not that assembly wouldn't make the difference, wouldn't shift the dial, but maybe the learning that you would get from that might help. And that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you. Thank you for those kind of hopeful images of where we could go with our democracy. I wanted to bring the audience in at this point. Have we got questions? If you put your hands up and a mic's going to come to you. So I'm going to take the first three I see, which is the gentleman here, gentleman at the front, and the gentleman with a very nice lime green t-shirt on. Yeah.
A question to Pippa and Sir John, if I may. In your discussion about political trends, what seems to me, I mean, I'm no young, I don't know very much, but when it comes to Senate elections, people almost always just tend to vote on economics, on their household income, on whether they can feed their family, on their mortgage. We've not really talked about inflation, the cost of living crisis, there's trust, for instance, which inflated mortgages would have, for a family I know, by £500 a month if they had locked it in over the summer previous. How do you think that would play in when actually this, we can talk about Citizens' Assembly, when people really have to think in an election campaign, it'll probably be on those issues they vote, I imagine. What will the consequences of that?
Thank you. And then the gentleman. Thank you.
Sorry, can you give us your names just so we know who you are? What's your name, sorry? Theo.
Jim, it was just an important clarification to Pippa. I think you said that you expected the Tories to propose tax cuts in the spring, and Labour would have to match it, or have I got that wrong?
Thank you. Sammy, I was quite interested about one of the PowerPoint slides that John had on there about saying that a 12-point lead was required in the polls for Labour to get a bare minimum. I think that's the one, yeah. Now I'm quite curious about that one because I think a 12-point lead is also what Tony Blair had in 1997, which is when obviously he got, well, a majority much larger than one, let's say. Let's put it mildly. So I'm just wondering, like, what is the case for why, if that is the case, why is it so massive? I know there's different boundaries and we'll have different boundaries, but surely they can't make that much of a difference. Right? So I'm just sort of wondering what is such the major point that why the 12-point lead the bare minimum Labour House now when beforehand it was plenty, essentially.
Thank you. Pippa, do you want to take that clarification point about tax cuts?
So I don't think Labour will have to a Conservative promise on tax cuts, but I've spoken to a couple of shadow cabinet ministers who say that it'd be very difficult if the government proposes a tax cut for them not, politically it's a big advantage, doesn't it? given coming to your question, Theo, how affected everyone has been by the cost of living, and how the economy is, all the polling, I'm sure John will much more detail, but suggests that that is the main concern that voters have, followed by the NHS and migration. But any party which can offer, which has a strong economic offer, and Labour's thus far is, you can trust us to grow the economy, you can trust us to spend money wisely, you can trust us not to have a repeat of the Liz Truss fiasco this time a year ago. But that will be where voters are, primarily that's where voters are looking at what parties offer, and therefore that's why the parties offer when it comes to the cost of living in the economy is I think above all else the most important one on going into the election.
Thank you. So John, on the economy and the 12-point lead.
Yeah, voters don't always simply vote about the economy. They certainly didn't in 2019. 2019 was very much an election about ideology and people's attitudes towards the Brexit vote. And the truth is the problems that the current government faces are also not, they are partly about economics, but they're not simply about economics. So I always get extremely annoyed when people start quoting these polls about, people say these are the most important issues, because this is not the way to get at what are the things that are persuading people to change their minds. The only way you can get at the way in which people change their minds, which I did this for the Tories last week, is to actually look at the relationship between people's evaluations of how a party is doing on an issue and their likelihood of remaining loyal, okay? So the economy is part of the Conservative problem. Part of the problem why people are defected from the Conservatives is that those people who think the economy is doing badly, and there are a lot of them, who voted Conservative in 2019 are particularly likely to defect. But the other issue that's undoubtedly costing the Tories badly is the NHS. And I will congratulate this party today for focusing on the issue of NHS waiting lists. Waiting lists was the crucial problem facing the NHS before 1997, which the new Labour government largely solved, and satisfaction with the NHS rose very dramatically. It's very clear that waiting lists for the public are also the problem now, and people's evaluations of the state of the NHS are also very strongly related to whether or not they're defecting the Conservatives. The issue that is not related to whether or not people are defecting the Conservatives is immigration. Conservatives on focusing on immigration are basically chasing a mirage, okay? Yes, their core voters want less immigration. Yes, Leave voters would like less immigration, but that's not the reason why they're defecting. The reason why they are defecting is to do with the fiscal and economic crisis that this government has found itself having to deal with. But it's the fiscal and it's the impact on public services. It isn't just the economy, which is why the whole lot. I mean, the public have so far. I mean, yes, Liz Truss has reacted against the very substantial expansion of the role of the state that's occurred under this Conservative government, but the public so far have not, because they are concerned about the state of public services. I mean, I agree with Pippa. I mean, I would say two things to any party that thinks they have to match tax cuts. Number one is look at the history. The Labour Party promised no increases in income tax after 1997. They increased national insurance in 2001. The Conservatives promised no increases in taxes after 2019. Well, Boris Johnson was in the end going to introduce a social care and health levy, although it then got reversed, which was a manifest breaking of Boris. But by simply freezing the tax thresholds, they have increased the tax burden very, very considerably. At some point, oppositions need to learn that making promises about not increasing taxation is potentially creating a cross by which you crucify once you are in office. And given the record of this government on taxation, there is no way that this government is going to be able, even if it can afford any tax cuts, which could well be impossible. Jeremy Hunt is quietly trying to tell his party the money isn't there because of the impact of the rise in interest rates on the fiscal situation. But even if they did, the point is, how do you believe anything that is said by a government that's presided over the biggest increase in taxation since 1945? So, I mean, I would say, guys, just don't be quite so concerned. Now, that's right, okay? And this is part of the argument about the current electoral system, right? And the problem with the current electoral, I mean, I speak as somebody who would argue that there are other ways of reforming the system other than using proportionality, but we'll leave that to one side. The problem with the current electoral system, even by its own standards, which is to produce majoritarian government, is that whether or not it produces a clear majority for whoever wins, isn't simply dependent on how many votes you get, but on how they are geographically distributed. Before 1997, this party profited from the geography of its support because A, it was winning more votes in constituencies with relatively small constituencies, and B, its vote was efficiently spread. That is, it was winning a lot of seats with relatively small majorities. The opposite was the case in 2019. The Conservatives, when they started winning those red wall seats, were picking up seats with small electorates. London, meanwhile, by the way, has been growing in electorates, so therefore the London constituencies, which are mostly Labour, have grown in size, and meanwhile the distribution of Labour support is now much less efficient than it was before 97, and of course also Scotland is also to its disadvantage. So, this is perfectly illustrates why, in the end, my view is if you believe in majoritarian government, you should still be in favour of electoral reform. It simply would be a different kind of electoral reform than the one that Jess would be in favour of. But for so long as you insist on single member constituencies, you cannot have a systematic guaranteed relationship between the seats, the votes that a party gets and the seats that they get, whether that relationship is proportional or majoritarian. And that, for me, is the Achilles heel, and it is neatly illustrated by the very, very different psephology that this party faces now from what it faced before 1997. I'm
keen to take one more round of questions before and I'm looking for some women. Over in the middle there, and the gentleman at the front afterwards.
Thank you. Andrew. Is it on?
Yes.
My name is Judith, and I have a particular interest in the health service. I'm very concerned with what the two ladies at the end said. I'm going to look you up afterwards about the politicians listening to their electorate and taking note of what they think is important. I was involved in 17 different health service developments.
I am going to say we're up against the hour, so I'm going to ask you to move to a question quite quickly, please.
Now, those of all 17 of them have gone. It was all about participation by patients and public, and that's disappeared altogether. How can we get it back?
Good question. And the gentleman at the front here.
Thanks, I'm Wally. If the Labour Party is about to show why people should vote for them, is there a key demographic or demographics that should be shown that to? And it's up to you whether you make that an allegation or based on or not.
I'm going to ask Miriam and Sarah to quickly respond to colleague's question.
Yeah, I'd love to come to your question on the health service. I think it's really interesting who you talk to and how you're trying to engage with the electorate on what really matters to them about the NHS. Because if you just look at what politicians are doing, they're often just looking at the wiring diagram of the NHS and kind of which institutions. And now we've got integrated care boards, and previously we had primary care trusts, and they move bits around the system the way we kind of move deck chairs on the Titanic. It's not very helpful, and people don't really care whether they're getting their care from primary healthcare trust or the local, or kind of which bit of the institution gives them care. They just want really good care. And that's really critical. So it's actually really important to understand what people actually want and need. And one of the really, really interesting things that we found is that after staffing, the issue that people cared most about in terms of challenges facing the NHS was the really, really poor communication between the NHS and patients. It's like, we know that when we actually get to see a doctor, we'll get really great care, but they can't even send me a letter on time that's going to tell me when my appointment is, and I don't know who to chase up when the letter doesn't arrive, and I really want to change my appointment and I don't know how. That poor communication, absolutely up there in terms of what people care about, nowhere on the political agenda. And that's really problematic because it's very easy to ignore the things that the people, if you don't listen to what people are actually telling you the problems are, if you don't get deeply into that, politicians will address the wrong issues. And in many ways, addressing the issues of communication probably a darn sight easier than building 40 new hospitals, and that's what people actually want. So I would always say, come back to what people actually want and need and tackle those first.
Anything to add, Sarah?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, mate. And Miriam's put it very, 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 very well. I would only add the one kind of gloss on it, which is that it could be tempting to think that we mean something that's very knee-jerk, that's like, let's just ask people what they want and supply them with that. The kind of processes that Miriam described that Engage Britain did, and the kind of processes that we do at Evolve, are all about bringing expertise and lived experience of patients and experts, like I'm sure it was your experience, Judith, in your work, all together and thinking together around a solution. And it's not a quick process. It does take a bit of time and investment, but the cost of not doing it is ludicrous and very high. So that's the only thing I'd kind of add to the persuadable part of this, I think.
Thank you. John's go.
Short answer to your question, Willie, is no. A slightly longer answer to your question is, well, if you wish to, I mean, because essentially what's happened is this: the support that this party has gained since 2019 is basically across the board, so far as demographics are concerned. But you might want to argue as a party that this age profile is not necessary. I mean, in the long run, it's to your advantage. But I think some of you want to win the election before in the next 20 years' time. And there are an awful lot of people, I'm now one of them, an awful lot of people in the over 65s, and they do tend to turn out and vote. So, you might want to do something about that. The other thing I would say, again, just be aware, there's perhaps a tendency to think that the only battle that is going on, so far as you're concerned, is with the Conservatives.